In this episode, I want to talk about writing. Now, don't click off. Don't hang up just yet. Bear with me for a minute. Hear me out. I'm not going to talk about the kind of writing you were made to do in high school or in college. I teach that kind of writing, and I'm not going to talk about that. I'm not going to talk about writing for business. I'm not going to talk about creative writing. What I want to talk about is personal, private, expressive writing. The kind of writing that you do by yourself and for yourself only, without any regard to spelling or grammar or any external forms of rules that you might have learned before. And the reason I want to talk about it is because it turns out that this kind of writing can be particularly helpful if you're in the middle of a severe life crisis. The sudden death of someone you love, for example, or the betrayal of a spouse, or the loss of a livelihood, or the rise of a life-threatening disease, those sorts of things. Why and how can writing become a good thing for us in such negative circumstances? And this is what I want to talk about in this episode. And in order to draw you in a little bit, I begin by telling you a couple of true stories, short little vignettes, of people in stressful situations and how writing entered into their picture. I'm also going to talk with Tom Allbaugh, who graciously and bravely shares how writing about his son's suicide a year and a half ago helps him. I also talked to Dr. Hud McWilliams, a longtime psychologist and counselor, about why he will sometimes request that a client of his spend time writing a little bit every day. So anyways, I hope you'll stay tuned. I'm Steve Zelt.
You're listening to a small good thing.
Good thing.
Small good thing with Steve Zelt.
With Steve Zelt.
Recently, I was talking to a friend of mine that I haven't seen in a couple of years. We used to live in the same neighborhood when our kids were growing up. His kids and our kids went to the same school together and they played together, so we knew them pretty well. Anyway, I was talking to him over the holidays and I asked him how everybody was, and he said that one of his daughters, I'll call her Heather, had gotten divorced. And I was kind of surprised by this, and I asked him what happened. Heather was always one of those girls you liked to be around. When she was young, when she grew up, she was fun. She was always talkative. She laughed easy. And she had that gift of always making you feel that she really was interested in you. But more than that she understood you and how you felt. She was the spark at any party. My friends were surprised too. He told me that one day last year sometime, Heather just showed up at their house in tears. Apparently, there had been problems in her marriage that nobody was aware of, and now something had caused it all to come to a head. She was just so hurt, she said. Her dad and mom tried to console her and to talk to her, but they couldn't get many specifics out of her. She was just so overcome with raw emotions. They let her stay with them because she said she just couldn't go back to the house. And as the days went by, my friend and his wife would try to talk to her, but they could never get very far before she would either start crying or get mad at them for asking questions or something. Anyways, he told me that one time she just said, "I can't think about it, Dad. I can't think about anything right now. Every day it's like I'm living in the middle of a tornado." Well, eventually, Heather agreed to see a counselor with her husband. And I asked my friend how that went. He said that she liked the counselor and that she, the counselor, had asked Heather to spend a little time every day just writing down her thoughts and her feelings. My ears perked up when I heard that, and I asked how Heather responded to that. My friend said that she never did it. It was just too painful, she said. I met a guy about a year ago. His name is Tom. He's about my age. Here's a story he told me about himself. Many years ago, maybe 15 years or more, he owned a business, a very successful business, in the little town that he lived in. However, because of some things he did, he was arrested on felony counts of fraud. It was a huge scandal because he and his business were well known in the town that he lived in. Well, as a result of that, he told me, he lost his business. He was separated from his wife for 7 months. His kids wanted nothing to do with him because his picture was in all the newspapers and they were embarrassed to go to school. It was the worst time in his life, Tom told me. He could become violently angry in those days, and he just didn't know what to do. So finally, he went to see a counselor, hoping he could get some help there. Well, after meeting with Tom for a number of months, the psychologist suggested that they go deeper, and he told Tom that what he wanted him to do was to move to a little cabin for 3 weeks and do nothing but be by himself and write several times a day. He was to talk to no one, not even the gas station guy or the grocery store lady when he went into town. He was only to be alone and write down whatever he was thinking or feeling. Once again, my ears perked up at that part of the story, and I asked Tom why his counselor wanted him to do that. He didn't know. Did it help you? Do you think your writing helped you in any way? I asked. I don't know, said Tom. I only know it was a terrible time. And for the record, I want to note that Tom and his wife got back together and are still together today. And Tom is his real name. And he speaks openly to people about that period of his life because he's become a different man, he says. Now, you will have noticed that in both those stories, the people involved, Heather, and that is not her real name, and Tom, decided to seek professional help in the form of a licensed psychologist. And in both cases, their counselors prescribed writing as a means of helping them work things through. In other words, those counselors believed that there was some kind of therapeutic value in writing, some healthful benefit. I called my friend Dr. Hud McWilliams in Colorado to ask him about this. Last year, Hud published his first book called The Discipline of Disturbance: Stop Waiting for Life to Be Easy. At the beginning of his career, he spent 9 years as a professor of psychology at Texas Wesleyan University. He has been a licensed psychologist in Texas since 1975 and in Colorado since 2000. He has been in private practice for over 40 years, which means he has spent thousands of hours helping people in tough times. I asked Hud if he ever has requested that a client of his spend some time writing.
Oh, yes, many times. And there's multiple reasons, probably, but I believe that we are very complex people, and that new angles or multiple dimensions of looking at whatever an issue or a problem or a challenge or something anticipated, etc., is almost always beneficial to us to have just more dimensionality to it. And one of the things that journaling does, or writing does, or trying to put your thoughts down in that way and actually using a pencil to do it, uses a different part of the brain than using a keyboard to do it or whatever. But the act of writing clarifies things in ways that just talking about it doesn't.
I'm sure that you don't ask all of your clients to spend time writing, but what kind of clients or circumstances, when they present themselves, suggest to you that writing might be a good thing for them to do?
I put people, maybe this is unfair, but for the sake of this conversation, I'd say there's kind of two general categories. One is crisis-driven, so I'm forced to face something. Maybe it's through the loss of a job, or my wife saying this marriage is over, or a kid dying, or whatever. That kind of crisis turns a light on in an area of our lives that a lot of times we have walked around in the dark, or at least it's dusk and you can't see half of it. So when the light comes on, there's lots of stuff to manage, if you will. And so I think this is a way to slow down the process and gather. I like that word, actually. Gather yourself and gather your history and gather your thoughts and gather your beliefs and values and decisions and gather a better understanding of yourself, etc. And so it's a way to contain that, I guess, would be the contain or gather that stuff. The other group are a group that actively want to seek out development. They want to grow. they see life as an opportunity to be stretched and challenged and explore and be curious and be curious about themselves. And what writing does is it gives another more dimensionality to that than just talking or thinking or musing somewhere. And I'll tell you a funny little tiny story about me. When I speak, a lot of times I want time to ruminate and reflect. And so it used to be that I would run, and now I bike. Biking is more distracting than running for this task. But I spend the time thinking, usually thinking about what the subject is or what construct I'd like to teach this next season or whatever it is. And I have literally ended a run trying to retain thoughts and with sweat pouring off of my hands, trying to write down some ideas. Yeah, it's powerful to capture, back to the word contain or gather, those things because they present themselves in a different dimension. And so to me, that's where writing really matters and helps if you can get people to discipline themselves enough to do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, why is that? Why do you think people resist writing so much?
Writing exposes you by making the obscure and abstract and ambiguous more concrete and intentional and deliberate. And it's all about, how do I do this relationship with myself, and how do I find space to taste and see. And it's like going to the doctor. You can get bad information or good information, but in a sense, not going keeps you in the dark. And I think there's value in turning the light on, and to me, that's the role of writing. It actually plays into how we were originally made, I believe, which is open and vulnerable and knowable, and we messed it up, and so we've hidden ever since. And so any act that will expose us is great, I think. So relationship does that, but you're talking in terms of writing about a relationship we have with ourselves, and I think that needs to be exposed just as vigorously as any other relationship.
Dr. Hud McWilliams. While I was listening to Hud, I remember something Greg Emilio said when we were talking together about the movie Patterson in episode 107. Greg felt that one of the things that the movie was saying is that our lives are important and that that's worth thinking about, and that we ought to take our lives seriously, he said. Writing is one way of taking your life seriously. I want to come back to the therapeutic value of writing in a minute, but before I do that, I want you to hear one more story about personal writing in times of extreme stress. Tom Allbaugh has been teaching writing at the college level since the 1980s. He and his wife Bernadette have 4 children and have lived in 5 different states. Since 2001, they have resided in Southern California, where he teaches at Azusa Pacific University just outside Los Angeles. In October 2017, 3 weeks after he published his first novel, his youngest son, Michael, took his own life. For the last 15 months, Tom has attended a Survivors of Suicide group and the 2018 Walk Out of Darkness held in Upland, California. He has also been writing, and he graciously allowed me to ask him some questions about his experience with writing since his son's death. Of course, Dr. Albaugh teaches writing, but I began by asking him to give me a little background about his own personal writing habits.
My own practices of writing have always been coming out of personal writing, really. I've often done free writing different times during the week, or I've often kept a journal off and on, although I've never been real legalistic about it. Now I'll often, because I started writing in the 60s when there were typewriters and ballpoint pens and so forth, I started writing by writing things down by hand and first, and I still notice that I still do that. So there's that connection. And I tend to start out just by jotting thoughts down, and then that leads to reflection, and I think about them later. And sometimes I develop them into essays, or because I am an English professor now, I develop them into stories or poems or essays, or sometimes nothing.
I'm wondering if you've noticed anything different in your writing now since October 2017.
That's a good question. I have noticed that maybe one change that's come about is I'm a little more deliberate in writing down something that I want to remember. I don't know. It's hard to speak about, but I've noticed that I'll write something down just in longhand, and I'll tend to try to stay with those words. I often, usually before I would try to revise over and over again and make it sound pleasant. But lately, I just have been trying to write things into the journal clearly and remember things. So much of my writing now is to try to remember and to try to, so because what happened in October of 2017, we lost our son, and I didn't, and my feeling was writing things down as I remembered them was a way of remembering him, and I think subconsciously it was a way of not losing him again in some way. And I for an entire year, most of my writing I did in a notebook that was read, that was just dedicated to writing about our loss and about him. But there are some passages where I'm just writing to my son directly. There are other passages where I'm writing about him. There are other passages where I'm jotting down things I remember, and then I'm writing to him again. And it's just anything that is there and comes to mind. And it's been very helpful for me to kind of draw connections and to. I think one of the big changes, Stephen, I guess it's taken me this long to get to this, but I think one of the big changes I might be able to see is I recognize now that I don't feel as much guilt as I did even 6 months ago. 6 months ago, I was still blaming myself. I hear a lot of parents blame themselves for their children's death. And the last 6 months, I've seen those thoughts are still there, but I think I'm outside of them a little bit, or maybe not outside, but I think I'm aware of a rounder and more full idea of what's really going on there, and I don't blame myself as much as I was doing 6 months ago even. So I've noticed that I've let go of that, though, in the last few months. I'm not doing my writing as much in that journal now.
So Tom, based on your experience, would you recommend writing to people who are going through very difficult times? What word would you give to them?
Yes, I think I would. Especially the kind of writing that we're talking about here, where it's formless and there's no worry about it being spelled right or anything. It's just, I think I would recommend it. But I don't think, Stephen, I don't think I would recommend it in isolation. I think I was talking with a student who was doing research on this, and we were in a conference, and she was talking about the research that she had done, and she had found that a lot of psychologists had said that this is the way to do it. Writing alone in isolation is not necessarily going to be cathartic, but writing along with, they recommended therapy sessions might help. So, I told you a few minutes ago that I feel less guilt today from writing, Well, I also think I feel less guilt because I've gone to meetings where I've heard parents. I've gone to a meeting where I said, "Oh, I'm going to talk tonight about how if only I'd done this and done this and done this and done this, our son would still be here." But before I had a chance to talk, 2 or 3 other parents just let out and said that very thing, and I realized, oh, it's not that it's trivial or anything, but I recognize that this is how we feel as parents. We're the protectors, and we feel we failed, and that's just unforgivable to us, and that's just unimaginative. And to see other parents going through this, it's, that along with my writing it's that sort of thing that gets affirmed in a kind of a real situation that, that's kind of what I'm basing this call on, Stephen. This is, the writing and the support group has kind of worked together to help me to make sense of things and to sort of get my feet steady on the deck again, so to speak,
All right, I'm going to put on my teacher hat now, and I'm going to call out and highlight some key points or takeaways from everything that's been said and maybe add a few things. Number 1, the kind of writing that we've been talking about, you don't care about spelling or grammar or any kind of rules or forms that you've been taught. Whatever you write is for your eyes only, okay? So, for example, if you write down something that you would be embarrassed if somebody read it, okay, well then burn what you've written after you write it. That's perfectly fine. There was a time in my life when I was going through some hard things, and I wrote a lot during that time. And many years later, about a decade later, I came across those writings. I had saved them. I'd put them back in the back of a shelf someplace, and I read them. And I destroyed them after I read them because I wouldn't want anyone to read them now. So the key thing to know is you're in control. The writing you do is just for you. Also, write as long as you can. Try for about 20 to 30 minutes. If you can't make it, that's fine, but shoot for that if you can. Write by hand, not a computer. As Hud pointed out, writing by hand engages a different part of the brain, and I would say it slightly differently. Writing by hand taps into the secret knowledge your body possesses that your conscious thoughts and feelings know nothing of. Your mind, that's different than your brain, is suffused throughout your body, I believe. You're not just a head and a heart, you are a body. And writing by hand brings all 3 of those things into collusion: head, heart, hand. Another thing I recommend is that you use a pen so that you don't waste time erasing things. You want to write spontaneously without looking back. Try to write every day, and if you can, at the same time of day, preferably right after you get up in the morning. Don't reread what you wrote the day before. Every time you write, start afresh. However, and this is the big however, there are no rules to this. The most important thing is to write. All right, number 2, as Hud implied and the research confirms, one of the benefits of writing may lie in its ability to help people shift their heavy emotional memories into language. Here's a quote. The conversion of highly emotional memories into linguistic forms may make events easier to understand and process by assimilating them into workable and less emotionally distressing memories. What's all that mean? Well, basically what it's saying is writing, quite literally, brings your feelings into the material world where you can see them more objectively. A different and maybe oversimplified way of saying it might be that writing calls upon the left side of your brain to assist your right side. In other words, writing can get all of your brain working for you. Now, this point follows on the last one, number 3. One of Hud's main points about writing is that it exposes us to ourselves. That's why we resist it. Any kind of exposure has the potential to be painful. So when Heather, that I talked about in the first story, said that she couldn't write because it was just too painful, she was expressing a truth that's confirmed in the psychological literature. Here's a quote. One potential problem with emotionally expressive writing, that's what we're talking about, is that people who engage in it often experience substantial psychological and somatic, that is bodily, distress immediately after writing. Such distress may represent a risk to individuals and thus be an impediment to the utility of writing exercises. There is some evidence that if people express similar levels of emotion in a safe context to a sympathetic listener, they may experience less emotional distress than those who just write alone, although both can have positive effects over the long term. Okay, once again, maybe that's a little abstract or academic, but to put it simply, what it's saying is what Tom Allbaugh shared, that he thought it would be good to write, but that also you should be trying to meet with people and be with people that you can talk to. And one final thing on this point about the possibility of it being too painful to write. The literature also shows that if a person can keep writing, if you can press through the first few days, even though it's distressing at first, the tension subsides, and then it can become more helpful, possibly even energizing. All right, number 4. However, one journal article notes, and here's the quote, writing could work like therapy because it may encourage people to disclose and process emotionally troublesome thoughts and events. But because people are not always inclined to verbally talk about traumatic events or may not be able to find sympathetic listeners, then in that case, expressing writing may be the most viable option for many people. And here I'm reminded of one of the things I learned from my friend Larry Enriquez in episode 103. When he talks with people who are suffering from some extreme circumstance, what he mostly tries to do, he said, is to get them to talk. He wants to help them not to sink down into the darkness of feeling alone and trapped, to help them to lift their head up into the light as much as possible. And talking, helping people get to words, is the best way to do that. Writing can be a vital first step to talking. Writing exposes us to ourselves. Writing is a way of being in relationship with ourselves, Dr. McWilliams says. And if that's true, then what that means is that writing can lead us into self-knowledge. 2,500 years ago, the great philosopher King Solomon said that the beginning of wisdom is to respect God. The great Greek philosopher Socrates, not too long afterwards, would say the beginning of wisdom is to know yourself. Then along comes the Christian philosopher Augustine, who sort of puts Solomon and Socrates together and prays, Lord, grant that I may know myself in order that I may know you. Dante appears 1,000 years later, and he writes his masterpiece, The Divine Comedy, in 3 parts, the Inferno, the Purgatory, and the Paradiso. I was listening to Stephen Smith talking about Dante the other day on the Great Books podcast. I recommended the Great Books podcast last December. The main difference between the people in hell and the people in purgatory, he said, is that the people in hell never knew themselves or desired to know themselves, while the people in purgatory had come to sufficient self-knowledge, and that self-knowledge gave them the ability to change their mind, which then allowed them to change the direction of their life. The unfashionable word for that process, of course, is repentance. But you don't need to get all worked up by that word. It simply means to change your mind in light of new information. Now, it occurs to me that in all this, I may have been painting a rather rosy picture about writing, giving you the impression that I think that writing is going to solve all your problems, that just by writing, somehow, all your troubles will vanish and you'll feel just fine and you will finally have reached the nirvana of full self-awareness, as if writing is some kind of magic wand. And of course, it's not. Still, all in all, I think that writing can be one good way for us to begin to know ourselves better, which then gives us the power to make better decisions so we can get a better grip on our lives and take more effective action to get the hell out. And think of this. The self-knowledge that we gain, difficult as it is to come by, and it is difficult, becomes not only a good thing for you personally, but it spins out and it becomes a good thing for people around you, to people you work with, people you live with, people you love, and who love and depend on you. I want to thank Hud McWilliams for being on the show and sharing his insights. There is a link to his homepage in the notes. There is also a link to the academic journal I was quoting from, as well as another link to some other research about how writing works. And finally, of course, I want to thank Dr. Tom Allbaugh for being willing to talk about his thoughts on writing, which can be kind of a cold subject in the midst of sorrow. I don't know whether you remember, but he mentioned that because he is an English teacher, sometimes his private writing will turn into something more public, like an essay or a story or a poem. It so happened that within days of his son's death, he wrote a poem that was used in the memorial service for his son. A few weeks ago, a literary journal called the River Heron Review notified Tom that they will be publishing that poem in their August issue. You can find a link also to that journal in the notes. I asked Tom if he would read that poem. I thought it would be a fitting way to end the show.
Can I say a word or two about it? Because it just started out as me writing to myself, and then when I did, one of my nieces read it at the memorial for Michael, and it just was simply called For Michael. And so, but anyway, this is a poem. It's called What We Must Do Now, and it's dedicated to my son Michael. What is length of days but the endurance of sorrows, when to go out for your season was to see the fragrant and flowering, and though broken among the broken, to frame jokes and healing and friendships before the light was lost and you slipped away from us. Though your choice includes you no more, always, we will not say you are lost. Lost refers only to us, to our words shaped to blame and loss, not carried away by wind, by time, by whatever is and will come. We go now and mourn in the days to come that will not now be seen, when you will not stop being ours, held forever in what remains of this length of days.